starving, after 30 hours without a single bite. She grabbed the bread from his table. Didn't ask permission. Didn't hesitate. Just needed to eat something. When she looked up, she saw who was sitting there. It was Chicago's most ruthless mafia boss, and his reaction was so unexpected that everyone in that upscale restaurant held their breath. Vivian Ashford was 28 years old, orphaned at 16, and she'd spent the last 12 years raising her younger brother Teddy, who'd been in a wheelchair for years due to a mysterious neurological condition that paralyzed his legs. She worked double shifts at La Notte Eterna, one of the city's most exclusive Italian restaurants, serving people whose single meal cost more than she earned in a week. $47,000 in medical debt hung over her head like a death sentence. That morning, she'd stood at the pharmacy counter, counted the crumpled bills in her wallet, and made the same choice she always made: Teddy's seizure medication over her own survival. But Jensen Corsetti, the 37-year-old king of Chicago's underworld, didn't call for the manager. He didn't humiliate her. Instead, he pulled out a chair, pushed the entire basket of bread toward her, and said 2 words that would change everything. Sit down. What happened next would drag Vivian into a world of blood, power, and a dangerous love she never saw coming. If you're hooked, smash that like button right now. Share this with someone who loves a dark romance. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the moment Vivian first stepped into that restaurant. 30 hours hungry, with no idea her whole life was about to change. Vivian didn't understand what was happening. She'd just stolen bread from one of the most dangerous men in Chicago, and instead of shouting or calling a manager, he'd invited her to sit down. Her legs trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion. 30 hours without food had turned her body into an enemy of its own. She stared at the chair he'd pulled out, then back into his steel gray eyes. There was no teasing in that look, no contempt, only a strange curiosity she couldn't explain. Vivian swallowed, tasting the last trace of bread on her tongue. She knew she should leave, apologize, bow her head, accept getting fired, but her legs didn't listen. They carried her toward the chair, and before she could fully realize it, she was sitting across from Jensen Corsetti. He slid the entire basket of bread toward her without a word, just watching. Vivian took a roll, her hand still shaking, and bit into it. Then another bite, then another. She ate as if this were the last meal of her life, and maybe for her, it really was. Jensen stayed silent, observing, until she'd finished a second roll. How long? His voice was low and even, not a question so much as an order that demanded the truth. Vivian looked up, crumbs clinging to her mouth. She meant to lie, to invent something that wouldn't sound so pathetic. But when she met his eyes, she knew lying was pointless. A man like this could read a falsehood from a mile away. 30 hours, she answered, her voice rough. He didn't frown, didn't soften with pity. He only gave a small nod, as if confirming a fact. Why? One word. Cold. Direct. Vivian looked down at her hands, at the thin fingers and nails cut so short they were nearly to the flesh. She'd kept this truth hidden for 12 years, told no one, complained to no one. But tonight, in this luxurious restaurant, facing a mafia boss, she opened her mouth anyway. My brother needs anti-seizure medication. Insurance won't cover it. I have to choose. Jensen tilted his head slightly. Choose between your brother's medicine and your own food. She nodded, saying nothing more. There was no need. He understood. Silence stretched between them, heavy, yet strangely not uncomfortable. Jensen reached for his wineglass, took a sip, and never took his eyes off her. How old are you? 28. Your brother? 22. Unable to walk since a childhood injury triggered a slow-growing complication. When have you been taking care of him? Since I was 16. My parents died in a car accident. Vivian didn't know why she was saying these things. Maybe she was too tired to keep guarding her secrets. Maybe because in this man's gaze she didn't see judgment, only listening. And that was something she hadn't had for 12 years. Suddenly, someone appeared at their table. Gianna Moreno, the restaurant manager, stood there with a face gone pale. She stared at Vivian, sitting with the most important VIP guest, eyes wide with horror. Mr. Corsetti, I'm so sorry. This employee will be fired immediately. I didn't know she'd dare. Jensen lifted a hand, one small gesture, and Gianna fell silent as if her throat had been squeezed shut. She's on her break. His voice was ice. And she'll continue working here. If I hear she's treated badly, I won't be happy. Do you understand me? Gianna swallowed hard, nodded again and again like a puppet, then disappeared so quickly Vivian almost didn't see her move. Vivian looked at Jensen, not knowing what to say. Thank you felt too small. Why sounded too rude. So she chose silence. Jensen stood, smoothing the front of his expensive suit. He pulled a business card from his inner pocket and placed it on the table in front of her. Vivian looked down. A black card, with only a string of phone numbers printed in silver ink. No name, no title, no address. If you need anything at all, he said, his voice still cold but touched by something else. Call me. Then he walked away, and his 2 bodyguards followed at once like shadows. Vivian sat there, staring at the card in her hand, her heart pounding out of rhythm. She didn't know what she'd just stepped into. She only knew that her life, from this moment on, would never be the same again. Vivian stepped down from the last bus close to midnight, her legs aching after a 12-hour shift. Englewood at night was never quiet in any comforting way. A police siren wailed somewhere in the distance. A dog barked from a dark alley. Hip-hop thumped from the downstairs apartment. She walked fast past graffiti-covered walls, her hand gripping the pepper spray buried in her jacket pocket. 12 years living here had taught her never to let her guard down. Her studio was on the 3rd floor of a worn-out building, its concrete stairs cracked and crumbling, the hallway lights flickering like they were about to die. She unlocked the door with a key worn smooth, stepped inside a cramped room not even 30 square meters. Teddy was sitting in his old wheelchair by the window, staring out at the Chicago night sky. He turned when he heard the door, a bright smile spreading across his pale face. You're home. His voice was weak but cheerful. I've been waiting for you all evening. Vivian forced a smile, walked to her brother, bent down and kissed his forehead. I'm sorry, baby. Tonight's shift was crazy. Have you eaten yet? Teddy shook his head, his wide eyes fixed on her. I waited so we could eat together. Vivian's heart tightened. She looked around the room, knowing there was nothing in the fridge but an expired carton of milk and half a shriveled lemon. She went to the kitchen shelf, opened the cabinet, and found the last packet of ramen sitting alone in the corner. Just one. For 2 people. She boiled water, dropped the noodles into the pot, added the seasoning packet. The smell of instant noodles rose warm and savory through the damp, mildew-stained room, and Vivian realized her stomach was still calling out, even though she'd eaten several rolls at the restaurant. But those rolls had been Jensen Corsetti's. She didn't know if she should feel grateful or ashamed. Maybe both. She ladled the noodles into 2 bowls, deliberately giving Teddy the larger portion. He noticed immediately. You gave yourself less again. He frowned and pushed his bowl toward her. I'm not that hungry. A lie. Vivian smiled and slid the bowl back. I ate at the restaurant. Leftovers from customers. She lied without blinking, and Teddy looked at her with the gaze of someone who knew she was hiding something. But he didn't press, only lowered his head and ate, each strand chewed slowly, as if he wanted to stretch this meal out forever. They ate in silence, the old TV murmuring late-night programming in the background. Vivian glanced at the small desk in the corner, where a pile of medical bills rose like a mountain. $47,000. That money could buy a new car, could pay rent for 5 years, could change their lives. But for her, it was only a weight she couldn't lift. Each month she managed a few $100s, and each month the interest stacked on top, like a monster that never stopped growing. Her hand drifted to her pocket without thinking, to the black business card resting there. She pulled it out and stared at the phone number, silver ink glinting beneath the weak yellow light. If you need anything at all, call me. Jensen Corsetti's voice echoed in her head, low and steady, making no promises yet offering no threats either. She didn't know why he'd given her this. She didn't know what he wanted from her. And most of all, she didn't know if she had the courage to call. Is something wrong? Teddy's voice pulled her back. She quickly shoved the card into her pants pocket and turned to her brother with a strained smile. It's nothing. I'm just tired today. Teddy tilted his head, worry brightening his eyes. You know you're not good at lying, he said softly. Your face looks different. Something happened at the restaurant, didn't it? Vivian wanted to tell him. She wanted to talk about that strange man, the way he'd looked at her, the business card burning in her pocket. But she couldn't. Teddy already had too much to carry. His body, his health, his future. She didn't want to add one more burden to his shoulders. "I just dealt with a picky customer," she said, keeping her tone light. "It's nothing serious. Don't worry." Teddy studied her for a few seconds, then nodded, not forcing it. He was always like that, knowing when to stop, knowing when she needed her own space. That was what Vivian loved most about him. She washed the bowls, helped Teddy into bed, tucked the blanket around him carefully. The room had only one narrow bed, and every night she gave it to Teddy while she slept on the battered old sofa in the corner. "Sleep well, okay?" she whispered, switching off the light. "You too." Teddy's voice came through the dark. "And Vivienne, whatever it is, don't forget you're not alone. You've got me." Vivienne stood in the darkness, tears rising to the edge of her eyes. She didn't answer, only crossed to the sofa and lay down, her hand still gripping the card in her pocket. Outside the window, Chicago stayed awake, stayed loud, stayed cold, and inside a shabby Southside apartment, Vivian Ashford lay there with her eyes wide open on the ceiling, wondering if this was the bottom of the pit, or if it could get even worse. At that same time, only a few miles north of Englewood, Jensen Corsetti stood before the glass wall of his penthouse on the 62nd floor, looking down at Chicago glittering with lights. He'd taken off his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and held a glass of whiskey he hadn't taken a single sip from. The image of that girl kept haunting him. The way she'd bitten into the bread as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The way she'd looked up at him, not afraid, not begging, only carrying an honesty so sharp it felt cruel. 30 hours without food because her brother needed medicine. Jensen had met thousands of people in his life, had stared into an enemy's eyes, had watched men fall to their knees and plead for mercy. But no one had ever looked at him the way she had, as if he were just a normal man, as if the name Corsetti meant nothing at all. "Rico," he called, without turning around. The living room door opened, and Riccardo Benedetti stepped in, tall, quiet, absolutely loyal. "Yes, sir. The girl at the restaurant tonight. Her name is Vivian Ashford. Find out everything about her. Family, work, finances, all of it. And Rico." Jensen turned, his steel-gray eyes locking onto his guard. "Be discreet. I don't want her to know." Rico nodded, asking no questions. He'd worked for Jensen long enough to understand his boss never did anything without a purpose. When Rico left, Jensen turned back to the window, and memory crashed over him like a tidal wave. He remembered the cramped apartment in Little Italy, where he'd grown up with his mother after his father was shot dead in a gang hit. He remembered the smell of hospital antiseptic, the steady rhythm of the ventilator, and his mother's thin hand gripping his for the last time. Maria Corsetti had fought breast cancer for 2 years, and for those 2 years, Jensen, 13 years old, had done whatever he could to make money. Washing dishes, running deliveries, even stealing. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Chemotherapy cost money. Radiation cost money. Pain medication cost money. And they had no insurance, no relatives, nothing but each other. His mother died on a winter night when snow blanketed Chicago, and Jensen sat beside her hospital bed, his hand wrapped around hers, watching the heart monitor line slowly become a straight line. He was 15, and he'd sworn he'd never let himself or anyone he cared about die because there wasn't money. 22 years later, he'd kept that oath. He'd built an empire from blood and ash, become a name that made all of Chicago tremble. But tonight, watching that girl eat bread with hunger in her eyes and pride in her spine, he saw himself at 15 again, helpless and desperate. "What are you thinking about?" A familiar voice sounded behind him. Frank Corsetti, his uncle, 62 years old, hair gone white, and eyes still sharp as a blade. He stepped into the room with an unlit cigar in his hand. "Nothing," Jensen answered, turning to face the man who'd raised him after his mother died. "Just a long day." Frank studied him, suspicion heavy in his gaze. "I heard you protected a waitress at La Notte Eterna tonight, right in front of Gianna." Rumors spread fast. Jensen took a sip of whiskey. It wasn't a big deal. Not a big deal. Frank moved closer, his voice dropping. "You're Jensen Corsetti. Everything you do is a big deal. You shield an outsider, people will start asking questions. She's just an employee," Jensen said, his tone cold. "Her manager was bullying her. I corrected a small injustice." Frank watched him for a few seconds, then let out a slow breath. "You're so much like your mother. She always wanted to save people who couldn't be saved. And you see how that ended. Jensen didn't answer. He knew his uncle was right. In their world, compassion was weakness. Caring was a weapon enemies could use. But when he closed his eyes, he still saw Vivian Ashford's gaze, proud and broken at the same time. And he knew he wouldn't be able to leave her there. Rico came back 30 minutes later with an iPad, the screen filled with everything on Vivian. Orphaned at 16, parents killed in a car accident, raising a brother with a chronic neurological condition ever since, medical debt of $47,000, working 2 shifts a day, living in Englewood. Jensen read every line, his jaw tightening. Englewood, one of the most dangerous areas in Chicago, the highest crime rate in the city. And she walked home close to midnight every day. Put someone on her, he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Protect her from a distance. If there's any threat, remove it. But don't let her know. Rico nodded. Yes, sir. Frank stood in the corner of the room, shaking his head slightly but saying nothing. He knew that once Jensen made a decision, no one could change it. And looking into his nephew's eyes, Frank understood that Vivian Ashford had touched something Jensen had buried a long time ago. It could be his salvation, or the destruction of them both. A week passed, and Vivian tried to forget that night. She worked, went home, took care of Teddy, slept a few hours, then woke up to work again. The black business card still sat in the bedside drawer. She didn't touch it, but she didn't throw it away either. Sometimes in the middle of a shift, she'd suddenly remember Jensen Corsetti's cold gray eyes, and she'd wonder if he remembered her at all, or if she was just one of 1,000 faces he'd seen and forgotten. But she didn't have time to think about it. Teddy had seemed more exhausted lately, his headaches lasting longer, and the anti-seizure medication didn't seem to work the way it used to. She'd scheduled a doctor's appointment for next week, but next week never came. That night, Vivian got home at 11 o'clock, later than usual because there'd been a big party at the restaurant. She opened the door and found Teddy already asleep on the bed, the blanket tucked around him, his face peaceful in the streetlight spilling in through the window. She slipped off her shoes, took off her coat, and dropped onto the sofa without changing. Her eyes had barely closed when the sound began. At first it was a small groan, then ragged breathing, then the jerking started. Vivian sprang up like a coil, her heart hammering out of control. In the dim light she saw Teddy seizing on the bed, his whole body shaking violently, his eyes rolled back, white foam gathering at the corner of his mouth. Teddy. She threw herself to the bed, hands trying to steady his head so he wouldn't slam it against the frame. She'd seen Teddy's seizures hundreds of times over the last 12 years, but never like this. Never this violent. Never this long. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. It didn't stop. Vivian snatched up her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely press the numbers. 911. Her voice screamed into the line, so raw she almost didn't recognize it as her own. My brother is having a seizure. It won't stop. Please come now. She gave the address. She begged. She cried. And the entire time she kept Teddy's head cradled, watching him convulse, as if his body were trying to destroy itself from the inside out. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, but those 8 minutes felt like 8 years. Paramedics rushed in, lifted Teddy onto a stretcher, injected anti-seizure medication, placed a breathing tube. The convulsions slowed, then stopped completely. But Teddy didn't wake up. He lay there motionless, his face pale as a leaf, and Vivian felt as if her heart were being crushed in a fist. She climbed into the ambulance, gripping Teddy's icy hand, her eyes never leaving him for even a second. The vehicle tore through the night, siren wailing and ripping apart the silence of Englewood, and Vivian prayed to whatever might be listening, begging it not to take the only family she had left, Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Blazing lights, white corridors, the sharp sting of disinfectant in her nose. Teddy was rushed into the emergency room, and Vivian was stopped outside. She stood there, staring through the glass, seeing doctors and nurses crowd around her brother, seeing monitors flash, seeing serious faces. Time moved like thick syrup. 1 hour, 2 hours. Vivian sat on a cold plastic chair, head bowed, hands clenched together so tightly her nails dug into her skin. She wasn't crying anymore. Her tears had run dry a long time ago. She just sat there, hollow, waiting. Close to 3 a.m, a middle-aged woman in a white coat stepped out. Her face was stern but not cold, her eyes behind her glasses carrying the fatigue of someone who'd worked too many hours. "Miss Ashford," she asked. "I'm Dr. Helen Park. I'm overseeing Teddy's case tonight." Vivian shot to her feet, her heart pounding. "How is my brother?" Dr. Park studied her for a moment, then let out a quiet sigh. "We've stabilized him, but the CT scan shows a small tumor in the brain, pressing on the area that controls movement. That's why the seizures have been getting worse." "A tumor." Vivian's voice sounded strangled. "Cancer. We can't be sure yet," Dr. Park said. "We need surgery to remove it and do a biopsy. It's a complex operation, but if we don't do it soon, the tumor will keep growing and the seizures will become more and more dangerous. It could be life-threatening." Vivian felt the floor collapsing beneath her feet. Surgery. Complex. Life-threatening. "How much will it cost?" she asked, her voice trembling even though she already knew the answer would shatter everything. Dr. Park looked at her, sympathy in her eyes but nothing that could change the truth. "About $80,000. That includes surgery, the ICU, medication, and rehabilitation. $80,000. The number rang in Vivian's head like a death bell. She already owed $47,000. She made $2,000 a month, and half of that went to rent and medicine. She would need 40 years to earn that amount, and Teddy didn't have 40 years. Teddy might not even have 40 days. "I don't have insurance," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't have money for a deposit." Dr. Park went quiet for a moment. "I'm so sorry, Miss Ashford, but without a deposit, the hospital can't proceed with surgery. That's policy. I wish I could do something." Vivian stood there, watching Dr. Park turn away, watching the emergency room door close, watching the world around her break into pieces. Then her legs couldn't hold her anymore. She leaned back against the cold wall and slowly slid down to the floor, knees pulled in, both hands covering her face. And in the empty hospital corridor at 3 a.m, Vivian Ashford cried. She cried for Teddy, for the parents she'd lost, for 12 years of fighting alone with no one to help her. She cried for the unfairness of life, for a fate that never seemed to release its grip on her. She cried until there were no tears left, until there was only the choking sound of sobs trapped in her throat. And then, in the ashes of her despair, an image rose in her mind, the black business card, the silver phone number, and the low, warm voice of the man who'd told her, "If you need anything at all, call me." Vivian pulled out her phone with trembling hands, opened her wallet, and yanked out the crumpled business card she'd stuffed in there a week ago. She stared at the silver phone number glinting under the hospital's fluorescent lights, and one part of her screamed that this was insane, that she knew nothing about this man except that he was a mafia boss, that calling him at 3 a.m. could be the biggest mistake of her life. But the other part, the part that had fought for 12 years to keep Teddy alive, the part that had sacrificed everything for her brother, didn't care about consequences. She dialed. The phone rang once, twice. Then there was a click, and a low, warm voice came through, fully awake as if 3 a.m. was no different from 3 p.m. "I knew you'd call," Jensen Corsetti said, without a hint of surprise. Vivian opened her mouth, trying to speak, but a strangled sob slipped out instead. She tried to steady herself, tried to keep her voice firm, but tears kept spilling down her cheeks, unstoppable. "My brother," she whispered, her voice breaking apart. "He needs surgery, $80,000. I don't have the money. I don't know what to do." Silence for 1 second, then 2. "Which hospital are you at?" "Northwestern Memorial." 40 minutes, Jensen said, and hung up. Vivian stared at the dead screen, not knowing if he was really coming, not knowing if she'd done the right thing or the wrong one. She only knew she'd run out of choices, and Jensen Corsetti was the last piece of driftwood in the storm. She sat there, counting every minute. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Each minute felt like a year, and she started to think maybe he wouldn't come. Maybe she was only a cruel joke of fate. Then, exactly 40 minutes later, the elevator doors slid open, and Jensen Corsetti stepped into the hallway. He wore a black dress shirt, no jacket, no tie, his hair slightly tousled as if he'd just gotten out of bed, but his gray eyes were still sharp as a blade, and his presence made the entire hospital corridor feel smaller. Rico followed behind, silent as a shadow. Vivian stood up, her legs still shaking. He stopped in front of her, looked her up and down, took in her swollen eyes from crying, her wrinkled restaurant uniform, the desperation she couldn't hide. "Tell me," he said, his voice without emotion but not cold. And Vivian told him. She told him about the seizure, about the tumor, about the $80,000 she would never have. Her words came out broken, halting, but Jensen listened without interrupting, without asking questions, only giving the occasional nod. When she finished, he went quiet for a moment. Then he spoke. "I'll pay the $80,000. Vivian stared at him, not trusting her own ears. "What? I'll cover the surgery," Jensen repeated, as calmly as if he were talking about the weather. "And I'll erase your entire $47,000 of medical debt. You won't owe anyone a single cent." Vivian's heart raced out of control. She searched his face for a hint of mockery, for a cruel joke, but his gray eyes only held hers, steady and certain. "What do you want in return?" she asked, her voice trembling, because she knew nothing was free. No one handed over more than $120,000 without demanding something. "You'll work for me," Jensen said. "1 year. Not at the restaurant. On another project." Vivian swallowed hard. "What kind of project?" "You'll find out when you start." He tilted his head slightly. "My terms are simple. You work, you get paid fairly, and your brother gets treated. Nothing shady, nothing illegal. At least nothing that involves you." Vivian looked at him, into those deep gray eyes, trying to read what he was thinking. But Jensen Corsetti was a wall she couldn't penetrate. He didn't reveal anything he didn't want revealed. "Why?" she asked, barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this for me?" Jensen was silent for a moment. Then he answered, his voice a shade softer. "Because I've stood where you're standing, and no one helped me." The answer hit Vivian like a punch. She stared at him and saw, in those cold gray eyes, something that flickered too fast for her to catch. Pain. Loneliness. Or only the memory of a 15-year-old boy watching his mother die. Rico stepped forward and handed Jensen a leather briefcase. Jensen opened it, pulled out a stack of papers and a pen. An employment contract. He set it on a nearby table. "You can read it before you sign. Everything is clear. Salary is $5,000 a month. Health insurance for you and your brother. Term is 1 year. $5,000 a month." Vivian almost couldn't breathe. That was 2.5 times what she made at La Nota Eterna. Plus health insurance. Plus the surgery. Plus wiping out her debt. She picked up the papers and read every page, every line. Everything was legal. Everything was clear. No hidden clauses. No trap she could see. And even if there was, what choice did she have? Teddy was lying in the emergency room. The tumor was growing inside his brain. Every second that passed was a second closer to death. Vivian took the pen and signed the last page, her signature shaking but legible. She handed the contract back to Jensen, and he took it, studied her name for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Done." He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and lifted it to his ear. The person on the other end answered almost immediately. "This is Jensen Corsetti," he said, his voice ice-cold. "Patient Theodore Ashford at Northwestern Memorial needs emergency brain surgery. Approve it now. I'll pay in full." He listened for a moment, then answered, "Good," and ended the call. Less than 3 minutes later, Dr. Helen Park appeared at the end of the corridor, her face filled with surprise and confusion. "Miss Ashford," she said, looking at Vivian, then at Jensen, then back at Vivian. "We just received notice. Your brother's surgery has been approved. We'll proceed first thing tomorrow morning." Vivian stood there, staring at Dr. Park, staring at Jensen, not knowing what to say. She wanted to cry, to laugh, to drop to her knees and thank him, but she only stood there, shaking, silent. Jensen turned to her, his gray eyes unreadable. "Go home and rest," he said. "Your brother will get the best care, and when he recovers, I'll contact you about the job." Then he turned away, Rico following, and Vivian watched him disappear behind the elevator doors. She'd just signed a contract with the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago. She didn't know if she'd been saved, or if she'd sold her soul to the devil. But right now, watching Dr. Park prepare for Teddy's surgery, she didn't care. Teddy would live, and that was all that mattered. The surgery lasted 7 hours. Vivian sat in the waiting room the entire time, not eating, not sleeping, only praying. When Dr. Park came out with a tired but relieved smile and told her the operation had been a success and the tumor had been removed completely, Vivian cried again. but this time they were tears of happiness. 3 days later, Teddy woke up. He was weak, his head wrapped in bandages, but his eyes were still bright, and his smile was still as warm as it had always been. He asked where she'd gotten the money, and Vivian lied, telling him a charity had helped. Teddy didn't fully believe it. She knew that, but he didn't ask again. A week later, when Teddy had been transferred to a rehabilitation center and his condition was stable, Vivian's phone vibrated. A message from Jensen's number, an address and a time. No explanation, nothing else. That morning, Vivian stood in front of an old building in the West Loop and looked up at a red brick facade where workers were renovating. Scaffolding wrapped the outside, the whine of drills echoed from within, and a glossy black Bentley was parked by the entrance. Jensen was waiting for her at the doorway. Today he wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, less intimidating in appearance, yet still carrying an undeniable authority. Rico stood a few steps away, eyes constantly sweeping the area. "You're on time," Jensen said as she came closer. "I appreciate that." Vivian didn't answer, only looked at the building and then back at him. "This is the project you meant." Jensen nodded and motioned for her to follow. They walked inside, past the construction zone, and Vivian began to understand what was taking shape. An industrial kitchen with a 6-burner gas range, shining stainless steel counters, commercial refrigerators, racks for spices and cooking tools. This would be a real professional kitchen. A culinary academy, Jensen said, his voice carrying through the empty space. A free chef training program for people who can't afford to attend a formal culinary school. Vivian turned to him, unable to hide her surprise. "Free. Completely free." Jensen answered. "Students will be trained by top chefs, provided housing and a living stipend for the entire course. After graduation, they'll be placed in restaurants within my network or supported in opening their own places." Vivian fell silent, trying to process it. This wasn't what she expected from a mafia boss. Weapons, money laundering, hired collections. Those were things she could understand, but a charitable culinary academy. "Why?" she asked, the question that always returned. "Why are you doing this?" Jensen didn't answer right away. He walked to the window and stared out, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, lower, farther away. "My mother used to dream about opening a small restaurant," he said. "She was an incredible cook. Her risotto was the best thing I've ever eaten in my life, but she never got the chance to make that dream real." Vivian stood still, listening. "She died when I was 15, Jensen continued, his tone steady but weighted with something heavy beneath every word. "Cancer. We didn't have insurance. We didn't have money. I did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough." He turned and looked at her, his gray eyes deep. "I swore at her grave that I wouldn't let anyone die from being poor the way she did. This academy is part of that oath." Vivian understood then. She understood why he'd helped her that night. Not because he wanted something from her, but because she'd reminded him of himself. Of a 15-year-old boy standing helplessly as his mother slipped away. "So, what's my job?" she asked. Jensen stepped closer. "You studied at Le Cordon Bleu, didn't you? 2 years, before you had to drop out because of money." Vivian nodded, stunned that he knew. "I want you to finish your training here," Jensen said, "and at the same time, help with selecting and training students. You've got skill, real-world experience, and most of all, you understand people like the students will bring in, because you used to be one of them." Before Vivian could respond, a man came in through the back door. He looked about 55, solidly built, salt and pepper beard, wearing a spotless white chef's coat with a blue neckerchief. His face was stern, but his eyes brightened when he saw Jensen. "Jensen, you're earlier than I expected," he said, a faint French accent coloring his words. "Raymond, this is Vivienne Ashford," Jensen introduced. "The person I told you about. Vivienne, this is Chef Raymond Dubois. He used to be the head chef at Le Bernardin in New York, and he'll be overseeing training at the academy." Raymond looked Vivienne up and down, assessing but not dismissive. "The girl Jensen can't stop talking about," he said. "I hear you left Le Cordon Bleu in your 2nd year." "Yes, chef," Vivienne answered, forcing her voice to stay steady. "For financial reasons." Raymond nodded. "Talent can't be bought with money, but money can kill talent. I've seen too many people like you." He turned to Jensen. "I'll test her skills tomorrow. If she's as good as you say, I'll take her. If not, you'll need someone else. Fair, Jensen said, then looked at Vivienne. Tomorrow, 8 in the morning. Don't be late. Vivienne looked at him, looked at Raymond, looked at the kitchen slowly forming around her. A week ago, she'd been stealing bread from customers just to get through the day. Now she stood here, being handed an opportunity she'd never dared to dream of. I won't disappoint you, she said, not sure if she was speaking to Jensen, to Raymond, or to both. Jensen watched her for a moment, then nodded, and Vivienne could have sworn she saw something, almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth. I know you won't. At exactly 8 the next morning, Vivienne stood in a kitchen that still smelled of fresh paint. An employee handed her a spotless white chef's jacket, a black apron, and a pair of slip-resistant shoes. She changed in the small staff room tucked into the corner of the building, stared at herself in the mirror, and almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. The last time she'd worn a chef's uniform was nearly 10 years ago, the day she left the Culinary Institute with a shattered heart and an empty bag, right before the medical bills began to swallow her life whole. Chef Raymond was already waiting in the kitchen, standing beside a stainless steel counter with his arms folded across his chest. He didn't greet her, didn't make small talk, only pointed at the gas range and said, "Fried eggs, 2. The yolks should still run, but the whites must be fully set, no burnt edges. You have 5 minutes." Vivienne nodded and moved to the stove. She grabbed a pan, lit the flame, dropped in butter, and waited until it melted and foamed. She cracked 2 eggs into a small bowl first to check them, then gently poured them into the pan. The sizzle rose, and the scent of butter filled the air. She tilted the pan, letting the hot butter wash over the still translucent whites, cooking them through without flipping. 3 minutes later, she turned off the heat, left the eggs in the pan for another 30 seconds to use the residual warmth, then slid them onto a plate. 2 eggs lay perfect, whites smooth and fully cooked, yolks still gleaming like miniature suns. No scorched edges, no greasy puddles. Raymond stepped forward, studied the plate, then took a fork and cut into one. The yolk flowed slowly, not too thin, not too thick. He tasted a bite, chewed with deliberate slowness, and Vivienne realized she was holding her breath. "Good," Raymond said, not looking at her. "Basic technique is solid. Heat control is good, not rushed." Vivienne understood it was praise, even with his voice still cold as ice. In the world of professional kitchens, not being criticized was already a form of recognition. "Next," Raymond said, "I want to see how you cut onions. Julienne, 100 grams, even cuts." And the test went on like that. Vegetables, garlic, a bechamel sauce, fish prep. Raymond didn't praise her again, but he didn't criticize her either. He only watched, nodded, then set the next task. By noon, when Vivienne finished the last dish, a simple plate of pasta aglio e olio that demanded finesse in balancing garlic, chili, and olive oil, Raymond tasted it and, for the first time, looked straight into her eyes. "You wasted 3 years at that restaurant," he said. "Your skills aren't bad. You've got a lot to learn, but you have a foundation. And more importantly, you've got instinct." "Thank you, chef," Vivienne answered, her heart racing. "Don't thank me yet." Raymond turned away. "This is only the first day. I'm going to make you want to quit at least 10 times before we're done. But if you can endure it, you'll become a real chef." He walked out, leaving Vivienne alone in the quiet kitchen. She looked around at the gleaming equipment, at the afternoon light slipping through the windows, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a real thread of hope. 3 floors above, in a temporary office on the top floor of the building, Jensen Corsetti sat in front of a computer monitor, watching everything through the security cameras. He'd watched Vivienne cook eggs, slice onions, make pasta. He'd seen the way she focused, the way she didn't flinch under Raymond's harsh standards, the way she handled every ingredient with respect and care. Rico stood by the window, studying his boss who'd been staring at the screen for 3 straight hours. "You care about her," Rico said, his voice flat but the meaning unmistakable. "More than anyone I've ever seen." Jensen didn't take his eyes off the screen, where Vivienne was cleaning the counter by herself. He didn't answer. Rico didn't ask again. He'd worked for Jensen long enough to know his boss's silence sometimes spoke louder than words. And this silence, with Jensen watching the girl on the screen with eyes that weren't as cold as they usually were, spoke volumes. On the monitor, Vivienne lifted her head as if she could feel someone watching. She glanced around the empty kitchen, then gave a small shake of her head and went back to work. And Jensen stayed there, silent, observing, not knowing that his heart, the thing he thought had frozen 22 years ago, was beginning to melt. About 10 miles south of the West Loop, inside a gated mansion in Bridgeport, Victor Santini sat in a pitch-dark office, the only light coming from a laptop screen and washing over the scarred planes of his face. Victor was 40 years old, once the right hand of Jensen's father before he was cast out of the Corsetti family for betrayal. He'd spent the last 10 years building an empire of his own, quietly gnawing away at Jensen's territory piece by piece, waiting for a chance to get revenge. And it looked like that chance was finally coming. The phone on his desk vibrated. Victor picked it up and listened to the voice on the other end, his dark eyes slowly brightening. The caller was one of the construction workers at the Culinary Academy, a plant Victor had slipped in 3 months earlier after hearing Jensen was investing in the project. At first, Victor had only wanted a way to sabotage it, maybe delay the timeline, maybe cause a worksite accident, anything that would cost Jensen money and make him look weak. But today's information was far more interesting. Corsetti goes there every day, the informant said. There's a new girl working there, Vivian Ashford. The way he looks at her is different. Not like the way he looks at anyone. Victor narrowed his eyes. Keep talking. He paid for her brother's surgery. $80,000. Didn't ask for anything. And he's got people watching her, protecting her 24/7. I checked. She's just a former restaurant server. Nothing special. Victor went quiet for a moment, turning the silver ring on his pinky finger. Jensen Corsetti, the coldest boss in Chicago. The man who'd ruthlessly eliminated every rival to take control of the family after his father's assassination. The man who'd never let anyone get close. The man whose emotions seemed to have died the day his mother did. That Jensen Corsetti was caring about a restaurant waitress. Victor let out a rasping laugh that echoed in the dark room. Finally, he said, pleasure thick in his voice. Finally, Corsetti has a weakness. He ended the call and turned to the black and white photograph on the wall. His father, the man Jensen had betrayed and driven out of the family 15 years ago, who later died in poverty and humiliation. Victor had sworn revenge, but Jensen had been too careful, too cold, with no weakness to strike, until now. Victor picked up his phone and dialed another number. Someone answered on the first ring. Find out everything about the girl named Vivian Ashford, he ordered. Family, work, daily schedule, all of it. And put someone on her, discreet. I want to know how important she is to Jensen. He hung up and leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile still on his mouth. Jensen Corsetti, you've made the biggest mistake of your life, and I'm going to make you pay for it. 2 weeks passed faster than Vivian expected. Every day she arrived at the academy at 7 in the morning, worked with Chef Raymond until evening, and learned techniques she'd only ever read about in books. Her hands grew calloused from gripping knives. Her back ached from standing all day. But she didn't complain once. This was the opportunity she'd waited for her entire life. Jensen stopped by from time to time, talking with Raymond about construction progress, checking on new equipment. He didn't speak to Vivian directly during those visits, only gave a brief nod of greeting and moved on. But she could always feel his gaze on her, and it left her both flustered and curious. Then one night, everything changed. Vivian stayed late to finish a sauce formula Raymond had assigned her to research on her own. Close to 11 at night, she was still at the stove, tasting for the 6th time, still not satisfied. She didn't hear footsteps. She only realized someone was there when the faint trace of expensive cologne drifted into the air. She turned and saw Jensen standing in the kitchen doorway, black shirt, a glass of wine in his hand, watching her with something she couldn't read. "You're still here?" he asked. "Not done yet," she answered, turning back to the pot. "What about you? I own this building. I can stay as long as I want." Jensen walked in, set his glass on the counter, and stopped a few steps from her. "What are you making?" "Demi-glace," Vivian said, stirring gently. "But it's still missing something. I keep tasting it and I can't figure out what." Jensen looked at the pot, then at her. "Let me try." She was surprised, but she ladled a small spoonful and offered it to him. Jensen tasted it, closed his eyes for a second, then nodded. "It needs a touch of acid. Try a few drops of red wine or balsamic vinegar." She did what he said, added a few drops of vinegar, stirred, tasted again. He was right. The flavor was instantly more balanced. She turned to him, unable to hide her surprise. "You know how to cook. My mother taught me. Jensen replied, his voice softer than usual. Before she died. It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother in a way that felt natural, not as part of explaining the project, but like a memory he actually wanted to share. Vivian turned off the stove and faced him. The empty kitchen suddenly felt more intimate. "I lost my parents when I was 16, she said, not knowing why she was opening up. "A car accident. A drunk driver crashed straight into them on their way home after their wedding anniversary dinner." Jensen looked at her, silent, listening. "I was home watching Teddy," she continued, her voice distant. "The police knocked on the door at 2 a.m. I knew the moment I saw their faces. They told me my parents died on impact, without pain, like that was supposed to comfort me." She paused and drew a deep breath. "It's been 12 years, she said. 12 years of raising Teddy alone, dropping out of college, doing any work I could find, washing dishes, cleaning, waiting tables. There were nights I didn't sleep because I was terrified about rent. There were days I didn't eat because Teddy needed his medication. And there hasn't been a single day I didn't wonder if I was doing the right thing, if my parents would be proud of me." Jensen didn't speak while she talked. He only stood there, listening, his gray eyes never leaving her. No judgment, no pity, no empty comfort, only presence. And somehow that presence made her feel understood more than any words ever could. When she finished, silence stretched between them. Then Jensen spoke, his voice low and certain. "You're stronger than most men I know." Vivian looked up at him, startled. He went on, his eyes still fixed on hers. "They crumble over things far smaller. Losing money, losing power, losing face. You lost everything when you were still a child. And you're still here, still fighting, still not giving up. That isn't weakness. That's a kind of strength most people never earn." Vivian felt her eyes burn. No one had ever said that to her. For 12 years, she'd felt like a failure, not good enough, not rich enough, never enough to give Teddy a better life. But the way Jensen looked at her, the way he spoke, made her see herself through a different lens for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered, not knowing what else to say. Jensen nodded, then turned and walked out of the kitchen. "Go home and rest, Vivian," he said without looking back. "Tomorrow will be a long day." She watched him disappear through the doorway and realized something that both frightened her and felt impossible to deny. She was starting to see Jensen Corsetti differently. Not only as the terrifying Mafia boss, not only as the man who'd saved her brother, but as a man with his own wounds and his own pain, slowly stepping into her heart. 1 week after that conversation in the kitchen, Jensen texted Vivienne. Short, as always. "Tonight, 7 o'clock, my penthouse. I'll cook." She read the message again and again 3 times, her heart beating faster than usual. This wasn't a work meeting. This was a dinner invitation. She wanted to refuse, wanted to keep a safe distance from this dangerous man, but her finger typed yes before her brain could stop it. At 7 that evening, she stood in front of the penthouse door on the 62nd floor, her hand gripping her old purse. Rico opened the door, nodded in greeting, then disappeared into the elevator. Vivian stepped inside, and her breath caught in her chest. The penthouse was bigger than her apartment put together 5 times over. Soaring ceilings, glass walls overlooking all of Chicago glittering with lights, minimalist interior in black, gray, and silver, beautiful enough to steal breath. But cold. Cold like a museum gallery, with no family warmth, no trace of life, no family photos, no souvenirs, nothing that said someone truly lived here. "You're here." Jensen's voice came from the kitchen. Vivian followed the sound, and what she saw surprised her. Jensen stood behind the kitchen island, wearing a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, stirring something on the stove. No jacket, no tie, no bodyguards, only him, and the scent of garlic sautéed in butter rising through the air. "You're really cooking," she said, unable to hide her surprise. "I said I'd cook," Jensen replied without looking up. "I don't lie." She stepped closer and looked into the pot. Mushroom risotto. He stirred with steady rhythm, adding stock 1 ladle at a time, patient as a real chef. "My mother taught me this," he said, his voice softer than normal. "She said the secret is patience. You can't rush. You can't walk away to do something else. You stand here, you stir, you wait." Vivian fell silent, watching him work. There was something deeply private in this moment. Jensen sharing a piece of his mother through food, and she felt like she'd been allowed into a corner he almost never opened to anyone. 15 minutes later, they sat across from each other at a dining table by the window. The risotto was perfect, fragrant with wild mushrooms, parmesan melting through it. Jensen opened an expensive bottle of red wine and poured her a glass and one for himself. They ate in silence at first, but the wine slowly loosened them both. "This place is so big," Vivian said, glancing around. "Do you live here alone?" Jensen nodded. "For 10 years. Don't you get lonely?" "Loneliness is the safer choice," he answered, eyes on the window. "When no one gets close, no one can hurt you." Vivian looked at him and saw herself in that sentence. She'd lived that way for 12 years too, letting no one close except Teddy because she was terrified of losing more. "But is that really living?" she asked softly. "Or is it just existing?" Jensen turned to her, his gray eyes deep. He didn't answer, but the way he looked at her said more than words ever could. "You already know the answer," he said after a long moment. They kept talking. About everything. About Chicago. About food. About the books Jensen read and the movies Vivian liked. She discovered he liked reading ancient Greek philosophy. He discovered she knew most of the recipes in Larousse Gastronomique by heart. They laughed, more than she would have believed, and Vivian realized she was truly enjoying this moment. Near 11, Jensen stood. "Let me take you home." Vivian nodded and followed him to the elevator. Rico was waiting downstairs with the black Bentley. They sat in the car, quiet, but not uncomfortable. When the car stopped in front of her South Side apartment, Jensen turned to her. "Thank you for tonight," he said, his voice unusually gentle. "You're the first person I've cooked for in 10 years. Vivian looked at him, her heart pounding out of rhythm. The distance between them was only inches. She could smell his cologne, could see tiny flecks of gold in his gray eyes. He could kiss her right now. She knew it, and the most frightening part was that she wanted him to. But Jensen didn't. He only gave a small smile, a rare one, then nodded. "Go inside. It's late." She opened the car door, stepped out, and looked back at him once more before closing it. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "And for the risotto. Your mother would be proud." Jensen didn't speak. He only looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. The car pulled away, and Vivian stood there watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. She went inside, leaned her back against the door, her heart still racing. She was developing feelings for Jensen Corsetti, a Mafia boss, the most dangerous man in Chicago, and that terrified her more than anything she'd ever faced in her life. 3 days after dinner at the penthouse, Jensen called Vivian while she was on her lunch break at the academy. "I want to meet your brother," he said. "No small talk. If you're willing." Vivian was silent for a moment, startled by the sudden request. "Why do you want to meet Teddy?" "Because he matters to you," Jensen replied. "And I want to know the people who matter to you." She didn't know how to answer. Part of her wanted to keep Teddy far away from Jensen's world, but another part, the part that was slowly beginning to trust this man, wanted to let them meet. "Okay," she said at last. "This afternoon, 3 o'clock, Mercy Rehabilitation Center." Exactly at 3, Vivian stood outside the facility and watched the familiar black Bentley pull up. Jensen stepped out. Today he wore a dark blue shirt and slacks, still polished, but less intimidating than usual. Rico wasn't with him. It was only Jensen. They walked into the center together, through white corridors smelling of antiseptic, to Teddy's room at the end of the hall. Teddy was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, reading a car magazine. He looked up at the sound of the door, and his eyes widened when he saw the stranger with his sister. "Teddy, this is Jensen Corsetti," Vivian introduced, her voice a little tight. "He's the one who helped pay for your surgery." She meant to add more, but Jensen had already stepped forward and shook Teddy's hand like he was a normal grown man, not a patient in a wheelchair. "Hi, Teddy," Jensen said, his voice calm. "I hear you like cars." Teddy studied him for a moment, cautious, then nodded. "Yeah. What do you drive?" "A Bentley Continental GT," Jensen answered. "W12 engine, 600 horsepower. Teddy's eyes lit up. "Seriously, I've never seen a Bentley in real life. When you get discharged, I'll let you take it for a drive," Jensen said, and Vivian almost couldn't breathe. He wasn't joking. She knew he didn't make empty promises. The two of them started talking. Cars, engines, speed. Then the conversation shifted to the Chicago Bulls. The basketball team Teddy followed obsessively, even though he'd never been able to see a game in person. Jensen knew more about basketball than Vivian expected, and he debated this season's lineup with Teddy like they were old friends. Vivian stood in the corner of the room watching, and something strange rose in her chest. He didn't pity Teddy. He didn't look at her brother with that helpless, sorrowful expression most people wore. He spoke to Teddy as an equal, respected his opinions, listened when he talked, and Teddy, her brother, who was usually wary of strangers, was grinning, more animated than she'd seen him in months. An hour later, Jensen stood. "I have to go," he told Teddy, "but I'll come back. And remember what I said about the Bentley." "Jensen," Teddy called as he turned away. "Thank you. Not for the car or basketball. For saving my life. My sister told me everything." Jensen stopped, looked at Teddy, then looked at Vivienne. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice serious. "You just have to get better and live well. That's enough." They left the center in silence. Vivian walked beside Jensen down the long corridor, neither of them speaking. By the time they reached the parking lot, the sky had turned toward sunset, orange-red light washing over Chicago. "Thank you," Vivian said, stopping beside the car, "for coming, for treating Teddy the way you did." Jensen turned to her, his gray eyes catching the sunset, warmer than usual. He stepped closer, close enough that she could count every eyelash. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice low. "Teddy's a good kid, and you've raised him well." Vivian looked up at him, her heart hammering. The distance between them was only inches now. He tipped his head down, and she knew he was about to kiss her. She knew she should step back, but she didn't. His mouth was a breath away from hers. She closed her eyes and waited, but the kiss didn't come. Jensen stopped, drew a deep breath, then pulled back. His eyes darkened, something torn and conflicted in that look. "I shouldn't," he said, his voice rough. "Go inside. It'll be dark soon." Then he turned, got into the car, and drove away without looking back. Vivian stood there in the empty parking lot, her heart still racing, her lips still trembling. She didn't know if she should feel relieved or disappointed, maybe both. She only knew that everything between them had changed, and there was no way back. A week after that afternoon at the rehabilitation center, Vivian still couldn't stop thinking about the moment Jensen had almost kissed her. They still saw each other every day at the academy, but he kept his distance, polite yet remote, as if that night had never happened. She didn't know whether to feel grateful or hurt. Maybe both. That night, Vivian stayed later than usual at the academy. Chef Raymond had assigned her to prepare the menu for next week's soft opening, and she wanted to finish it before she went home. Near 11, she was the only person left in the building. The construction crew had gone home at 6. Security was patrolling somewhere else, and she stood alone in the wide kitchen, testing a new sauce recipe. She didn't hear the noise downstairs, nor the glass shattering as intruders breached the building. The perimeter guard, whom Victor had secretly bribed weeks earlier, had intentionally stepped away, leaving the back entrance completely vulnerable to the attack. She didn't hear gasoline being poured across the wooden floor of the reception area. She only smelled smoke. At first it was faint, and she thought she'd forgotten to turn off a burner. But then the smell thickened, sharp and burning, and when she turned toward the kitchen door, she saw black smoke creeping in through the crack like ghostly fingers. Her heart clenched. She ran to the door and touched the handle. Hot. She pulled it open, and a wave of heat slammed into her face. The hallway outside was already a sea of fire. The flames spread with terrifying speed, licking along the walls, swallowing the wooden scaffolding, catching the dust tarps and erupting into a furious blaze. Vivian slammed the door shut and stumbled back into the kitchen, panic flashing through her mind. The windows. But the kitchen was on the second floor, and the windows were small panes that didn't open. The fire exit was at the end of the hall, but the hall was burning. She was trapped. Smoke pushed in thicker now, stinging her eyes, choking her throat. Vivian soaked a kitchen towel and pulled it over her nose, then slid down to the floor where the air was a little easier to breathe. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone. She called Jensen's number. 1 ring. 2. Then his voice came through, alert even though it was close to midnight. "Vivian, there's a fire," she said, her voice raw from smoke. "The academy's burning. I'm trapped in the second-floor kitchen. I can't get out." Silence for a second. Then Jensen's voice sharpened like a blade. "I'm coming now. Stay on the line. Don't hang up." Vivian heard fast footsteps, a door slamming, an engine roaring to life. Jensen was saying something to someone, probably Rico, but she couldn't make it out anymore. The smoke was too thick. She coughed hard, eyes burning, lungs tightening as if someone's hand was crushing them. "Vivian," Jensen's voice came through the phone. "Talk to me. Don't fall asleep. I'm here," she whispered, but her voice was fading. "There's too much smoke. I can't breathe." "I'm almost there," he said, and she could hear the panic under the calm he was forcing. 5 more minutes. Hold on for 5 more minutes. But Vivian wasn't sure she had 5 minutes. Her head swam, her eyes narrowed, her phone slipped from her hand. She heard Jensen calling her name, distant, like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. Then everything sank into darkness. Jensen arrived in 7 minutes, a record sprint from the penthouse to the West Loop. He saw the building engulfed, flames climbing the 2nd floor, black smoke rolling into the night sky, and his heart seemed to stop. No, he thought. Not again. He didn't wait for the fire department. He didn't stop to measure the danger. He charged straight into the building, through a half-burning doorway, through smoke-filled corridors, through flames licking at everything around him. Rico shouted after him, but Jensen didn't hear. He only knew Vivian was somewhere inside this hell, and he had to find her. The stairwell was burning. He leapt over collapsed steps and ran up to the 2nd floor. The smoke was so thick he could barely see, his eyes stinging, his lungs burning. He covered his face with his sleeve, felt along the wall, and found the kitchen door. The metal was scorching. He kicked it open. Vivian lay motionless on the kitchen floor, her skin pale, her hands still clutching the wet towel. Jensen dropped to his knees, pressed his fingers to her neck. A pulse, weak, but there. He lifted her into his arms, held her tight against his chest, and ran back out. The fire had spread across the stairs. He sprinted through a curtain of flame, feeling heat bite through his shirt into his skin. It didn't matter. Only she mattered. He burst out of the building just as part of the roof collapsed. Rico ran up, took Vivian from his arms, and called for an ambulance. Jensen stood there gasping, his shirt burned through in jagged holes, soot smeared across his face, his hands blistered from the heat. But he didn't feel the pain. He only watched Vivian, watched her breathe in shallow, fragile pulls in Rico's arms, and swore he would find whoever had done this, and he would make them pay in blood. The ambulance took Vivian to Northwestern Memorial, the same hospital where Teddy had undergone surgery. Jensen sat beside her the entire way, his hand locked around hers, his eyes never leaving, her pale face smeared with soot. Doctors rushed her stretcher into the emergency room, and for the first time in his life, Jensen Corsetti felt helpless. He stood in the hallway, staring through the glass, watching them fit an oxygen mask over her face, watching the heart monitor blink and pulse. His fist clenched so hard his nails cut into his palm, and blood seeped out, but he didn't feel it. Rico stood beside him, silent. He'd already called men to secure the hospital, 4 stationed at the lobby, 2 posted in this hallway. No one was getting near Vivian without going through them. "You need to treat your burns," Rico said, eyeing Jensen's blistered hands. "Later," Jensen answered without turning. "When will she wake up?" 3 hours later, close to 4 in the morning, a doctor came out with an update. "She inhaled a lot of smoke, but you got her here in time. There's no permanent damage to her lungs. She'll make a full recovery." Jensen didn't speak. He only nodded, then walked into her room. Vivian lay there with the oxygen mask covering half her face, hair spread across the white pillow, eyes shut tight. She looked small and fragile, and Jensen felt the fury in his chest flare like the fire that had devoured the academy tonight. He pulled up a chair beside the bed, took her hand, and waited. Vivian woke when early sunlight slipped through the curtains. She opened her eyes, blinked, and took a few seconds to understand where she was. Then she saw Jensen sitting at her bedside, still holding her hand, dark circles under his eyes, his scorched shirt still on his body. "You didn't go home to change?" she asked, her voice rough. Jensen looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Fear, relief, and a deep, cold, lethal rage. "I'll find the people who did this," he said, his voice like steel, "and I'll kill them." Not a threat, a promise. Vivian looked at him and saw the cruelty of the Mafia boss she'd tried to forget for the past weeks. She should have been afraid, but she wasn't. She only tightened her grip on his hand. 2 hours later, after Vivian had fallen asleep again and a nurse was watching over her, Jensen left the hospital. Rico had gathered enough. Security cameras from nearby buildings had captured 2 strangers breaking into the academy at 10:30 that night. Their car traced back to a used car dealership on the south side, a dealership Jensen knew very well. It belonged to Victor Santini. Jensen sat in the office of one of his clubs in the Loop, facing Rico and Uncle Frank. He read the report, studied the images, and the fury in his chest cooled, turning into something far more dangerous. Cold calculation. Victor wants war, Frank said, his voice heavy. He's provoking you. No, Jensen replied, setting the folder on the table. He wants to strike my weakness. He thinks Vivian is my weakness. He's wrong. She isn't my weakness. He stood, his eyes ice. She's the reason I'm going to burn down everything he has. Jensen summoned a meeting with every Kappa regime within 2 hours. 12 of the most powerful men in the Corsetti organization sat around a long table, silent, listening as their boss declared war on Victor Santini. No negotiation, Jensen said. No warning. Find every business he owns, every hideout, every place he sleeps. Burn it all, and bring me his head. That night, Jensen personally led a 10-man team to Victor's mansion in Bridgeport. They slipped in like ghosts, silently neutralized the outer guards, and smashed through the back door. The firefight was brief but vicious. Jensen shot Victor's 2 closest men, the ones who'd taken the order to torch the academy, with 2 precise rounds to the head. But when they reached Victor's office, the room was empty. There's a secret tunnel, Rico reported, checking a false bookcase. He ran. Jensen stood in the middle of the room, staring at the photograph of Victor's father on the wall, and he shattered it with 3 bullets. He can't run forever, Jensen said, his voice cold. Find him. Wherever he's hiding in this world, find him. He turned and walked out of the mansion, leaving behind 2 bodies and a warning written in fire. Jensen Corsetti had declared war, and he never lost. 2 days later, Vivian was discharged. She thought she'd be going back to her old apartment in Englewood, but when she stepped into the hospital lobby, Rico was already waiting with the black Bentley. Mr. Corsetti wants me to take you to the penthouse, Rico said, opening the car door. Vivian froze. I want to go home. Your apartment isn't safe, Rico replied, his tone leaving no room for debate. Victor Santini is still out there. Mr. Corsetti isn't willing to take the risk. Vivian wanted to argue, but she was too tired. The light burns on her arms still hurt. Her throat still burned from the smoke, and she didn't have the strength to fight Rico in the hospital parking lot. She got into the car and stayed silent the entire drive. Jensen was waiting at the penthouse when she arrived. He stood by the window, looking out over the city, then turned when the elevator opened. He'd changed clothes. The burns on his hands were wrapped, but the dark circles under his eyes said he hadn't slept since the night of the fire. How do you feel? He asked, stepping closer. I'm fine, Vivian answered, looking around the luxurious penthouse where she'd once been invited to dinner. But I can't stay here. I need to go home. Your apartment isn't safe anymore, Jensen said, his voice hard. Victor knows about you. He'll try to hurt you again. You'll stay here until I'm done with him, so I'm a prisoner. Vivian asked, anger flaring in her chest. You save me, and then you lock me up. It's not locking you up. It's protecting you. I don't need your protection, she said, her voice rising. I've taken care of myself for 12 years. I don't need anyone deciding for me. Jensen stepped closer, his gray eyes darkening. And what did those 12 years look like? He asked, his voice sharp. Hunger, exhaustion, carrying everything alone. You think that's strength. That's just self-destruction. What do you know about my life? Vivian shouted, tears spilling even though she tried to stop them. You sit in this penthouse with money and power. What do you know about choosing between eating and buying medication for your brother? What do you know about pretending you're strong when you've been broken inside for years? I know, Jensen said, and his voice dropped. I know exactly what that feels like. She looked at him and saw the pain he usually kept buried. Then why? She asked, her voice shaking. Why did you do all of this? Paying for the surgery, giving me the job, running into a burning building to save me. Why do you care about me? Jensen went quiet, staring at her. and Vivian saw the wall he'd built for years beginning to crack. "Because you're the first," he said, his voice rough. "The first person who looked at me like I was just a man, not a mafia boss, not a killer, not someone who could give them something. You looked at me, and you saw me. Only me." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his breath. "You're the first person who's made me want to live like a normal man," he whispered. "Want to go home not to work or plan, but to see someone. Want to cook not because I'm hungry, but because I want to watch someone eat. Want to wake up every morning not because there's business waiting, but because there's someone worth waking up for." Vivian couldn't breathe. She stared at him, at the gray eyes spilling everything he'd kept locked away, and she didn't know what she was supposed to say. "I tried to stay away from you," Jensen went on, like he was fighting himself. "I know I'm dangerous. I know my world will hurt you. I know I don't deserve you. But when I saw you lying in that smoke, when I thought I might lose you, I realized I can't stay away anymore. I don't want to stay away anymore." He lifted a hand and touched her cheek, gentle, as if he was afraid she'd shatter. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. "Tell me you don't want this, and I'll step back. I'll keep my distance. I'll do whatever you want." Vivian looked at him, the most powerful man in Chicago standing in front of her, more vulnerable and bare than she'd ever seen him. She should have told him to stop. She should have run as far as she could. But for 12 years she'd lived on reason, sacrificed everything for safety, never allowed herself to want anything for herself, and she was tired now. "Don't stop," she whispered. Jensen didn't need to hear it twice. He pulled her into his arms, his mouth found hers, and their first kiss ignited like fire. Not gentle, not hesitant, fierce, desperate, packed with everything they'd been holding back for weeks. She gripped his shirt and pulled him closer. He held her as if he was afraid she'd vanish. And in that moment, inside a penthouse that suddenly didn't feel cold at all, Vivian Ashford knew she'd stepped into a depth with no way back. She loved Jensen Corsetti, and that love was both salvation and something that could destroy them both. 3 days after their first kiss, Vivian was still at the penthouse with Jensen. They didn't talk about the future, didn't define what they were simply together. Every morning she woke in his arms. Every night they cooked side by side in the wide kitchen, and she began to forget that outside this penthouse, a war was unfolding. But the war didn't forget her. That morning, Vivian was making breakfast when her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello, Miss Ashford." A man's voice came through, low and dripping with malice. "I have a gift for you. Who are you?" Vivian asked, her heart starting to race. "My name is Victor Santini." The blood in her body seemed to freeze. "Maybe you've heard Jensen mention me." She didn't speak, but she felt danger crawling up her spine like cold fingers. "I want you to hear something," Victor said, and there was movement, a rustle, and then a familiar voice that shattered her heart. "Vivian." Teddy's voice, trembling with fear. "Don't come here. They want to kill." The words were cut off by the crack of a slap. Vivian screamed, "Teddy, your brother's fine." Victor came back on the line, calm as if he hadn't just struck a disabled man. "For now, what do you want?" Vivian asked, her voice shaking, her grip on the phone turning her knuckles white. "Simple," Victor said. "I want Jensen Corsetti. Bring him to Warehouse 7 in South Chicago, the old industrial zone by the river. Midnight tonight, just the two of you. If I see anyone else, if I smell cops or Corsetti's men, your brother dies, and I'll send you his body in pieces." The line went dead. Vivian stood there with the phone still pressed to her ear, her body numb. Teddy. They'd taken Teddy. Her brother was in the hands of Jensen's enemy, and she had no idea how long he'd stay alive. She ran into the living room, where Jensen was on the phone discussing work with someone. He saw her face and ended the call immediately. "What happened?" he asked, moving toward her. "Victor took Teddy," Vivian said, her voice breaking. "He called me. He wants to trade Teddy for you. Midnight tonight, a warehouse in South Chicago." Jensen's face hardened, his jaw tightening. "You stay here," he said. "I'll handle it." "No." Vivian shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Jensen said, his voice firm. "This is a trap. Victor wants to kill me, and he might kill you too. You stay here, safe, and I bring Teddy back." "And what if you can't?" Vivian shouted. What if something happens to you? What if something happens to Teddy? I can't sit here and wait while the two people who matter most to me are out there facing danger. The two people who matter most. Jensen looked at her, and even in the middle of this, she saw his eyes soften for a heartbeat when he heard her say that. But he still shook his head. I can't let you get hurt. That isn't your decision. Vivian said, her voice turning to steel. Teddy is my brother. I've raised him for 12 years. I've sacrificed everything for him. And you think I'm going to sit here while that madman threatens to kill him? Vivian. Jensen stepped closer and grabbed her shoulders. If you go, you could die. Do you understand that? I do, she answered, meeting his gaze. But if Teddy dies because I wasn't there, then I die too. Maybe not right away, but whatever is still alive in me will die. Do you understand that? Jensen stared at her and saw the resolve in her eyes. The kind that couldn't be moved. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror every day for 22 years. If you don't let me go, Vivian said, her voice cold. I'll go alone. He was silent for a long moment, then he exhaled, heavy and helpless. You'll do exactly what I say, he said at last, his voice strict. Stay behind me at all times. Don't act on your own. Don't put yourself in danger unless there's no other choice. Do you understand? Vivian nodded, her heart both relieved and terrified. I understand. Jensen turned and pulled out his phone. Rico, gather the team, he said. We've got a war tonight. At 11:45 that night, Jensen's convoy stopped, about 300 meters from Warehouse 7. The old industrial zone in South Chicago felt like a massive graveyard, abandoned buildings standing motionless under cold moonlight, shattered windows like empty eye sockets. Jensen checked his gun one last time and turned to Vivian in the car. You stay with Rico, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. When I signal, Rico will bring you in. You don't move on your own. Vivian nodded, but her heart was pounding out of control. Teddy was in there, maybe being tortured, maybe bleeding, maybe waiting to die. Every second that passed was a second she couldn't endure. Jensen and 10 of his men moved through the darkness, surrounding the warehouse from 3 sides. Vivian sat in the car with Rico, staring through the window, counting minutes. 5, 10. Then the first gunshot cracked the air, and hell began. Gunfire erupted everywhere, shouting, glass breaking. Vivian saw sparks flash in the dark, saw shadows sprinting back and forth, saw someone fall. She didn't know who. She couldn't take it anymore. She opened the car door. Miss Ashford, don't. Rico grabbed her wrist. Mr. Corsetti ordered it. I don't care. Vivian yanked free. My brother is in there. She bolted out before Rico could stop her, and ran toward the warehouse. She heard Rico calling after her, heard footsteps chasing, but she didn't slow down. She slipped through the back entrance, unguarded because the fighting was concentrated at the front. Inside it was pitch black, with only a few weak bulbs hanging from the high ceiling, the stench of motor oil, rust, and blood. Vivian followed the sounds, climbed a rusted metal stairwell, and reached the 2nd level, and she saw Teddy. Her brother was strapped to his wheelchair in the corner, his mouth taped shut, eyes wide with terror. Blood streaked from a cut on his forehead, but he was alive. Alive. Teddy, she cried, running to him. But before she could reach him, a hand seized her hair and yanked her back. Vivian screamed in pain, and Victor Santini's scarred face filled her vision. You got here faster than I expected. Victor laughed, hauling her upright and pressing a gun to her temple. Where's Corsetti? She didn't answer, only struggled. But Victor was far stronger. He dragged her beside Teddy and threw her to the floor. Fine, Victor said, aiming the gun at Teddy's head. If Corsetti doesn't show his face in 30 seconds, I'll shoot the kid first. Then you. No, Vivian screamed, lunging in front of Teddy, using her body as a shield. Kill me, she said, her voice trembling but her eyes locked on Victor's. Kill me first, but let my brother go. Victor looked at her, something almost like amusement sliding through his gaze. Brave, he said, but stupid. He lifted the gun and lined it up with her head. Vivian closed her eyes, clinging to Teddy behind her, bracing for the shot. But the gunshot didn't come from Victor. It came from the doorway. Victor screamed. The gun dropped from his hand as a bullet tore through his shoulder. He staggered back, blood spraying from the wound, and Jensen stepped into the room with his weapon still trained on Victor. Jensen's face was ice, his eyes two bottomless pits of rage. He walked up to Victor, writhing on the floor, kicked the fallen gun away, then planted his boot on the wound. Victor howled. "I should kill you," Jensen said, his voice cold as winter wind. "I should blow your head apart for daring to threaten the people I care about." But he didn't shoot. Instead, he stepped back and signaled to the men at the door. "Take him," he said. "Turn him over to the cops. I want him to rot in prison, every day knowing I spared his life, and he'll spend the rest of it in fear. That's worse than death." His men dragged Victor away, and Jensen turned to Vivian. He came closer, dropped to his knees beside her, his hand trembling as it touched her cheek. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice stripped of coldness, leaving only worry. Vivian shook her head, tears streaming. She fell into his arms, clinging hard, sobbing. "I was so scared," she whispered into his shoulder. "I thought I'd lose Teddy. I thought I'd lose you." He held her tighter, kissed the top of her head. "You're not losing anyone," he said. "I'm here. I'll always be here." Vivian lifted her face and looked at him, at gray eyes that were warmer than she'd ever seen. "I love you," she said, her voice breaking. "I know this is crazy. I know who you are. I know how dangerous your world is. But I love you, and I don't want to lose you." Jensen looked at her, and for the first time, she saw him truly smile. Not a polite smile or a mocking one. The smile of a man who'd finally found something he'd lost a long time ago. "I love you too," he said. "And I'll never let anyone hurt you again." They kissed in the dusty warehouse, with police sirens wailing in the distance, with Rico cutting Teddy free behind them. And Vivian knew that whatever the future held, she'd found where she belonged. 6 months after the rescue, the Culinary Academy opened its doors to its first class. The building had been rebuilt from ashes, more beautiful and more modern than before, with gleaming industrial kitchens, spacious classrooms, and a large sign at the entrance that read Maria Corsetti Culinary Academy, named after Jensen's mother. Vivian stood in the brightly lit kitchen, wearing a spotless white chef's uniform with her name embroidered over her chest beneath the words Head Chef. 20 students from the first cohort worked around her, all of them people who'd been poor like she once was, people who'd been pushed into corners by life, people who'd believed dreams were a luxury never meant for them. But now they were here, learning for free, given housing and a living stipend, offered a chance society had once refused them. And Vivian was the one guiding them. She'd finished her training under Chef Raymond, earned the certificate she'd been forced to abandon 3 years earlier, and now she was passing that knowledge on to people like her. Every time she saw a student's eyes light up when they successfully cooked their first dish, she remembered herself, remembered that starving night when she stole bread, remembered the long road that had brought her here. Teddy had recovered completely, too. He wasn't in a wheelchair anymore. He still needed a cane to walk, but the doctors called it a miracle. The tumor had been fully removed, the seizures had stopped, and Teddy now worked part-time at Jensen's office, handling information technology. He had health insurance, a steady income, and most of all, a future. That night, after the students had all gone home, Vivian stayed behind to prepare a special dinner, not for customers, not for a grand opening, for family. Jensen arrived at 7, along with Uncle Frank and Teddy. They sat around a wooden table Vivian had set right in the middle of the kitchen, under warm yellow light, surrounded by the shining equipment she'd once only dared to dream of touching. She cooked mushroom risotto from the recipe Jensen's mother had taught him, the pasta aglio e olio Chef Raymond had praised, and a simple chocolate cake Teddy had loved since he was little. They ate, they laughed, they told stories. Frank talked about the old days when Jensen was a child, when he'd been a skinny boy who used to sneak into the kitchen to watch his mother cook. Teddy talked about the tech projects he was working on, about his dream of starting his own company one day. And Jensen, the man who'd once been so cold all of Chicago feared him, sat there listening, smiling, his hand holding Vivian's beneath the table. When Frank and Teddy left, and only Jensen and Vivian remained in the empty kitchen, he pulled her to sit by the large window overlooking Chicago, glittering with lights. "Do you remember the first night we met?" he asked softly. Vivian smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. "How could I forget? The night I stole bread from the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago." "You didn't steal." Jensen smiled and kissed her hair. "You conquered." They sat in silence for a while, watching the city below. Then Jensen reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Vivian stared at it and felt her heart skip. "Vivian, I know we've known each other less than a year," he said, opening the box to reveal a diamond ring, simple but elegant. "I know life with me will never be completely safe. I know I have a dark past and an uncertain future, but I also know that since I met you, I've become a better man. You taught me that real strength isn't in making people fear you. It's in protecting the people you love." He dropped to one knee and took her hand. "Vivian Ashford, will you be my family?" Vivian looked at him, at the man who'd run into a burning building to save her, who'd stood in front of a gun to protect her brother, who'd given her the chance to reclaim the dream she thought she'd lost forever. Tears slid down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Jensen slid the ring onto her finger, stood up, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her in the kitchen where everything had begun. Outside the window, Chicago was still awake, still loud, still full of danger and opportunity. But in this kitchen, in the arms of the man she loved, Vivian Ashford finally found what she'd been searching for 12 years. Not money, not safety, family, love, hope that tomorrow could be better than today. And that, everyone, is the story of Vivian and Jensen. A story of hunger and fullness, despair and hope, darkness and light. A story that reminds us life can push us to the deepest edge, but with the right hand at the right moment, with the right chance at the right time, we can rise and fly higher than we ever imagined. So what's the lesson of this story? Don't ever give up on yourself no matter how hard things get. Believe kindness still exists in the places you least expect. Real strength isn't never falling down. It's always getting back up after every stumble. And most of all, love can change a person. It can heal wounds that feel like they'll never heal. It can turn a devil into a man, and an ordinary person into a hero. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and hit the like button so you can support us in bringing you more moving stories every day. Share this video with your friends and family to spread these values further. We want to know how you feel about this story. Have you ever lived through moments you thought you couldn't survive? Do you believe love can change a person? Leave a comment below. We always listen to what you're feeling from the deepest part of your heart. Thank you for watching this video to the end. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, and a peaceful spirit every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.